She was sold for a bottle of whiskey and a handful of silver coins. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the dusty town square as Sarah stood on the wooden platform, her small hands trembling against the rough fabric of her worn dress. The October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco that clung to the crowd below. Her eyes, wide and frightened, searched the faces for any sign of kindness, but found only cold calculation. Men with weathered hands and hungry stares. Women who turned away, unable to meet her gaze, their silence a judgment all its own. 12 years old, she had already learned that the world was not made for girls like her. Girls who could not hear the warnings whispered in dark corners. Girls whose silence was mistaken for stupidity. Girls whose fathers drank away their futures in smoky saloons while their mothers lay cold in prairie graves. The beating started low, like vultures testing the wind. A farmer with calloused hands and dirt under his fingernails raised his finger. His wife stood beside him, her face pinched with disapproval, but she said nothing. A merchant in a dusty coat nodded, his eyes calculating the value of young hands. For his store, Sarah's stepfather, Jake Morrison, stood near the platform with a bottle already half empty in his coat pocket. His face was flushed with drink and something that might have been shame if he had been capable of such an emotion. He had married her mother for the small inheritance she carried, spent it on cards and whiskey, and when the consumption took. Her last winter, he found himself with a burden he could not afford to keep. The numbers climbed slowly, each bit a nail in the coffin of her childhood. $5. $7. $10. The crowd murmured and shifted, some losing interest as the price rose beyond their means or their desire. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the only sound she could truly feel, vibrating through her bones like thunder. Before a storm. She had learned to read the world through vibrations and expressions, through the way people held their bodies and the cruelty or kindness in their eyes. Then she saw him. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a tall figure in a weathered hat and coat that had seen too many winters. His face was carved from granite and sorrow, lines etched deep around eyes that held the weight of unspoken grief. Unlike the others, he did not lean forward with eager anticipation. He did not whisper to companions or calculate profit in his head. He simply watched her, and in his gaze she saw something she had almost forgotten existed. Recognition, not of her face, but of her pain. He knew what it meant to stand alone in a world that saw you as less than human. The bidding continued around them, but Sarah found herself unable to look away from the stranger. There was something about the way he stood, solid and unmovable as an old oak tree, that made her think of safety, of shelter from storms she had weathered alone for too long. When the price reached $15, most of the crowd began to lose interest. The farmer's wife tugged at his sleeve, shaking her head. The merchant counted coins in his pocket and stepped back with a shrug, but the stranger stepped forward. He did not bid with the eager gestures of the others. Instead, he simply raised his hand once, firm and final, and spoke in a voice that carried despite its quietness. $20. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose. It was more than anyone had expected, more than a deaf girl was worth in the harsh mathematics of frontier life. He looked around the crowd, waiting for another bid, but the stranger's presence seemed to have settled something in the air. $20, the auctioneer repeated. Going once. Going twice. Sarah held her breath, though she could not hear the words. She could read the finality in the man's posture, the way the crowd had stepped back as if acknowledging his claim. The gavel fell with the weight of destiny. Thomas Whitmore had not come to town looking for a child. He had come for supplies, for the salt and flour and coffee that would see him through another lonely winter on his ranch. But when he saw the girl on that platform, something stirred in the hollow space where his heart used to beat freely. She reminded him of someone, not in her features, which were dark where Mary's had been fair, but in something deeper. The way she held her chin high despite her fear. The way her eyes seemed to see everything and nothing all at once. The way she stood alone in a crowd and somehow maintained her dignity. His wife had looked at the world that way, in those final days when the fever took her voice, but not her spirit. Mary had faced death with the same quiet courage this child was showing in the face of an uncertain future. The transaction was completed with the cold efficiency of commerce. Papers signed with scratching quills. Money exchanged with the clink of silver coins. The girl was his now, in the eyes of the law and the judgment of men. Though Thomas found the concept sat uneasily in his chest, he had never owned another human being, had fought against the very idea in a war that had cost him friends and innocence. But this was different, he told himself. This was rescue, not ownership. Protection, not possession. As he approached the platform, he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. Fear, yes, but not the broken terror of a beaten animal. She was afraid, but she was not defeated. Bent perhaps, like a sapling in a strong wind, but not broken, he offered her his hand, rough and scarred from years of working the land, building fences and birthing calves, and fighting the endless battle against weather and want. She hesitated, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to read his intentions in the lines around his eyes. Then she placed her small fingers in his palm, and he felt something shift in his chest. Her skin was soft and warm, alive with possibility, and for the first time in the 2 years since Mary's death, he felt something other than the dull ache of loss. They walked through the town together, past the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed in their wake, past the saloon where her stepfather had already disappeared to drink away his guilt and his windfall, past the church where prayers were offered for everyone except girls like her, who were seen as burdens rather than blessings. The wagon ride to the ranch stretched long and silent, except for the creaking of wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. Sarah sat beside him on the wooden seat, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of grass. Thomas found himself stealing glances at her as they rode. She was thin, too thin, with the sharp angles of a child who had known hunger. Her dress was clean but patched, mended with careful stitches that spoke of a woman's hand. Her mother's, perhaps, in the days before sickness took her strength. The sun was setting when they reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflected off the windows of the modest house. It stood weathered but solid against the landscape, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of honest work and simple living. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, his movements careful and deliberate. He had no experience with children, had never learned the easy way of speaking to them that came naturally to some. But something in her stillness told him that she was used to being careful too, used to reading the intentions of adults who held her fate in their hands. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house, clean and spare, but warmed by a quilt his wife had sewn years before. The pattern was of wildflowers, bright yellows and blues against white cotton, and he saw Sarah's fingers trace the stitching with something like wonder. There was a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a small chest for clothes she did not yet possess, and a window that looked out over the garden Mary had planted and he had tried to maintain. It was not much, but it was hers, and he saw her understand that in the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly. That first night, Sarah lay in the narrow bed and felt something she had almost forgotten. Safety. The walls around her were solid, wood and honest craftsmanship. The door had no lock, but somehow she knew she would not need one. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, and for the first time in months, She slept without fear. Thomas sat on the porch long after the girl had gone to bed, smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The tobacco was harsh and familiar, a comfort he had carried through war and loss, and the long years of solitude that followed. He thought of Mary, of the children they had planned but never had, of the silence that had filled the house since she died. It was a different kind of silence than what surrounded him now. The girl's quiet presence was not empty like his grief, but full of possibility, like the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. The next morning brought the first test of their strange new arrangement. Thomas rose before dawn, as was his habit, and found Sarah already in the kitchen. She had somehow managed to start a fire in the cast-iron stove and was attempting to make coffee with the determination of someone who had learned early that usefulness was a form of protection. He watched her for a moment from the doorway, noting the careful way she moved, the alertness in her posture. She was always watching, always ready, like a deer at the edge of a clearing. It was a survival skill he recognized, one he had learned himself in different circumstances. In muddy trenches where the wrong sound could mean death, he touched her shoulder gently to get her attention, and she turned with startled eyes that quickly softened when she saw his face. He showed her where things were kept, his hands patient and deliberate. The flour and salt in their wooden barrels, the eggs from the chickens that roosted in the coop behind the house, the way to work the pump at the sink that brought water up from the well. She learned quickly, her hands following his movements with the precision of someone who understood that knowledge was power, that competence could mean the difference between welcome and rejection. Within days, she had memorized the rhythm of the household, rising before him to start the fire, preparing simple meals with ingredients she found in the pantry. They developed a language of gestures and expressions that grew more complex with each passing day. A nod for yes, a shake of the head for no, pointing for direction, raised eyebrows for questions. Smiles that came slowly, but grew warmer with each small success. Thomas found himself remembering signs he had learned years ago from a deaf soldier in his unit, a man who had lost his hearing to cannon fire, but not his will to communicate. He taught Sarah these signs, and she taught him others she had developed on her own, and slowly they built a bridge of understanding across the silence that separated them. The work of the ranch provided structure to their days. Thomas tended the cattle, riding out in the early morning to check the fences and count the herd. Sarah managed the house and garden, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil with patience and an intuitive understanding of growing things. She had a way with plants that surprised him. The tomatoes that had struggled under his care flourished under her attention. The beans climbed their poles with new vigor. Even the herbs that Mary had planted seemed to respond to her touch, growing thick and fragrant in the small plot behind. The kitchen dot in the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names. Sometimes Thomas would read aloud from books, not because she could hear the words, but because the rhythm of his voice seemed to calm something restless in both of them. She would watch his face as he read, following the story and his expressions, and he began to understand that communication was more than sound. Weeks passed into months, and the harsh edges of their mutual wariness began to soften. Sarah's smiles came more easily, lighting her face with a warmth that reminded Thomas of summer mornings. He found himself humming old songs while he worked, melodies Mary had loved, and realized that the house no longer felt like a tomb. The girl was changing. Him, he understood. Her presence had awakened something he thought had died with his wife. Not love exactly, though he was beginning to recognize the protective tenderness that grew stronger each day. Something more like hope, the possibility that life could hold more than just the endless cycle of work and sleep and solitude. Winter came early that year, with snow that fell thick and silent across the prairie. Thomas worried about the isolation, about how the girl would handle the long months when they might not see another soul for weeks at a time. But Sarah seemed to thrive in the quiet intimacy of their shared space. She learned to cook from the supplies they had laid in for winter, creating meals that were simple but nourishing. She mended his clothes with stitches so neat they were nearly invisible, and he realized she must have learned the skill from her mother in the brief years before sickness took her away on the coldest nights when the wind howled around the house like a living thing. They would sit by the fire and play simple games. Thomas taught her checkers, and she proved to have a strategic mind that often left him scratching his head in defeat. She taught him a card game she had learned somewhere, played with gestures and expressions that made him laugh despite himself. It was during one of these evenings that Thomas realized something had changed between them. Sarah was no longer the frightened child he had bought in the town square. She moved through the house with confidence, claimed her space with the quiet authority of someone who belonged. And he no longer saw her as a burden or even a responsibility. She was family. The thought should have frightened him, should have brought back the familiar ache of loss that had been his companion for so long. Instead, it filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Spring arrived with a rush of green that transformed the prairie overnight. Sarah threw herself into the garden with renewed energy, planting seeds. They had ordered from the catalog, expanding the plot to include flowers as well as vegetables. Thomas watched her work and saw Mary in the careful way she tended each plant, in the joy she took in coaxing life from the earth. But it was also spring that brought the first real test of their new life together. Word had spread through the territory about the rancher who had bought the deaf girl, and not all the attention was welcome. Some saw Thomas's kindness as weakness, his protection of Sarah as an invitation to challenge his authority. The trouble started small, as trouble often does. Cattle went missing from the far pastures. Fences were cut in the night. Tools disappeared from the barn. Thomas knew it was harassment, an attempt to drive him off land that others coveted, but he could not prove it. Then came the morning when he found Sarah in the garden, tears streaming down her face, standing over the ruins of her carefully tended plants. Someone had ridden through in the night, trampling the young shoots and destroying weeks of work. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he looked at the destruction. This was not about land or cattle or the petty jealousies of small men. This was about Sarah, about the fact that he had dared to give value to something the world had thrown away. He knelt beside her in the ruined garden and took her hands in his, feeling the calluses she had earned through honest work, the strength that had grown in her small fingers. When she looked up at him, he saw not just sadness but anger, and he was glad for it. Anger was better than despair. Anger could be shaped into determination. Together, they began to replant, but Thomas knew that replanting a garden would not be enough. The men who had done this would not be satisfied with small cruelties. They would escalate, as bullies always did, until someone stood up to them or someone got hurt. He had hoped to live quietly, to raise Sarah in peace, and let the past stay buried. But the past, he was learning, had a way of demanding its due. And some fights, no matter how much you wanted to avoid them, came looking for you whether you were ready or not. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the air was soft with the promise of summer, and Sarah's replanted garden was beginning to show new growth. Thomas was mending fence in the north pasture when he saw the riders approaching the house, 3 dark figures against the green prairie. He recognized the leader immediately, even at a distance. Jake Morrison, Sarah's stepfather, riding with the casual arrogance of a man who believed might made right. The other two were strangers, but Thomas could read their type in the way they sat their horses. In the guns they were low on their hips. Thomas dropped his tools and ran toward the house, his heart pounding with a fear he had not felt since the day Mary took her last breath. But he was too far away, and the men were already dismounting, already approaching the door where Sarah stood frozen with recognition and terror. Morrison's voice carried across the yard, rough with drink and false authority. He had come for the girl, he declared, had changed his mind about their arrangement. The money was spent, but he had found a better use for her now. A man in the next territory who would pay good money for a young wife. Deaf or not, Sarah backed away from the door, her eyes wide with the same fear Thomas had seen that first day in the town square. But this time, something was different. This time, she was not alone, and she knew it. Her hand moved to the knife she kept at her belt for garden work, and Thomas saw in her posture the same quiet courage that had first drawn his attention. Morrison grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave marks. Sarah's mouth opened in a silent cry, and something inside Thomas snapped like a dry branch in a strong wind. He had been a peaceful man since Mary's death, content to live quietly and harm no one. The war had taken enough from him, had shown him enough of what men could do to each other when they let violence rule their hearts. But watching Morrison's hands on Sarah awakened something primal and protective, something that would not be reasoned with or turned away. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Morrison was bigger, but Thomas fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting what mattered most. The two hired guns reached for their weapons, but found themselves facing not just one angry rancher, but a girl who had learned that sometimes survival meant fighting back. Sarah's knife found its mark in one man's gun hand, and his weapon fell to the dust. The other hesitated, perhaps realizing that killing a rancher and his ward would bring more trouble than Morrison's money was worth. When it was over, Morrison and his companions were riding away, nursing bruises and wounded pride, with Thomas's promise ringing in their ears that they would not be welcome on his land again. More than that, Thomas had made it clear that any harm that came to Sarah would be answered in kind, and that he had friends in the territory who would not look kindly on men who preyed on children. Sarah stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her small body shaking with relief. And something else. Something that looked like gratitude mixed with a deeper emotion Thomas was afraid to name. That night, as they sat by the fire tending their wounds and trying to make sense of what had happened, Sarah did something she had never done before. She reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers, and her lips moved in words he could not hear but somehow understood. "Thank you," she was saying. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for showing me that not all men take what they want without giving something back." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. In that moment, he understood that he had not saved her at all. She had saved him, pulling him back from the edge of a grief that had threatened to swallow him whole. The seasons turned, and their life together found its rhythm. Sarah grew taller and stronger, her silence no longer a mark of damage but a choice. She spoke when she needed to, in the language of hands and hearts that they had created together, and Thomas learned that communication was less about words than about understanding. He taught her to ride, and she took to it with natural grace, her small hands gentle but firm on the reins. He taught her to read the weather in the clouds, to know when rain was coming by the way the cattle gathered under the trees. She taught him that love did not always need words to be real, that family could be built from choice as much as blood. The Ranch prospered under their joint care. The cattle grew fat and healthy on the rich prairie grass. The garden produced vegetables that were the envy of their neighbors, who began to stop by not just for trade, but for the warmth of genuine hospitality. The house filled with the kind of contentment that comes not from wealth, but from the presence of people who have chosen to care for each other. Word spread through the territory about the rancher and his ward, about the deaf girl who could make anything grow and the man who had given her a chance when no one else would. Some of the stories were true, others were embellished in the telling, but all of them carried the same message, that sometimes the most unlikely families were the strongest. On Sarah's 16th birthday, Thomas gave her a gift that made her cry. It was a deed, legal and binding, that made her a partner in the ranch rather than a dependent. She was no longer the girl who had been sold for whiskey and silver coins. She was Sarah Whitmore, landowner and equal, with a future that belonged to her alone. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah spoke aloud for the first time since coming to the ranch. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but clear and strong, carrying across the prairie like a prayer. "Thank you, Papa," she said, the word carrying all the love and gratitude she had stored up over the years. Thomas felt his heart swell with a joy he had thought lost forever. He had gained a daughter, and she had gained a father, and both had found something precious in the vast loneliness of the frontier. They had built a family from the ruins of their separate sorrows, and in doing so had discovered that love was not something you found, but something you chose to create. The ranch had become more than land and cattle and the endless cycle of seasons. It had become home in the truest sense of the word, a place where two wounded souls had found healing in each other's company, where silence had become a form of communication, and where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Since that morning, the ranch never echoed with silence again. Would you have opened your heart to someone the world had thrown away? Tell us in the comments what this story meant to you. And if you believe in the power of chosen family, subscribe to Silent Ranch for more stories of hope found in unexpected places.